Today we will discuss construction of words and phrases in a statute. Before anything else, just a disclaimer, the individual behind this YouTube channel is a law student. This is not an attempt to present himself as an expert in the field, but merely an effort to share his knowledge of statutory construction based on what he learns and understands in his study of law. This lecture is merely a supplement to your study of this subject. It does not seek to replace your reading materials or contradict what your professors have discussed with you. So let's begin. General words construed generally. General words in a statute are to be understood in their general sense. This is a corollary to the rule that ordinary words are to be understood in their ordinary sense, and the maxim ubi lex non distinguit nec nos distinguere debemos, which means where the law does not distinguish, neither should we distinguish. So go back to our previous discussion. This is still related to verba leges rule. When the language of the law is clear, there is no need for construction. In other words, we give the law its plain and ordinary meaning. What is generally spoken shall be generally understood, or general words shall be understood in a general sense. A general statement is understood in a general sense. Now let's have an example. For instance, the terms government and the term and national government. Okay? When we say government, it is understood in its implied and generic sense, meaning it includes not only the national government but also those government owned or controlled corporations. Why? Because it does not distinguish. So we should not distinguish. Like we said, they should be understood in their general sense. Okay? So it includes everything that is part of the government. So here we are giving the term its general meaning. Now, on the other hand, when we say national government, we explicitly mention national. So national government pertains to the central government. So here it is very specific. We are giving the term, therefore, its specific meaning. Let's go to proviso. Proviso is an article or clause in a statute that introduces a condition. The purpose of a proviso is to limit the application of the statute and it is contrary to the nature of a proviso to enlarge the scope of the law. Take note of the purpose of a proviso. Provisos are usually used to limit the application of a statute. Actually, provisos are those that we can read in statutes which says provided. Okay? Kunyari, kunyari lang ah. Kunyari may batas na nagsasabing every person should be given a house and lot. How do you understand that? It means lahat ng tao bibigyan ng house and lot. Is it not? But what if, subsequent to that, it provides that every person should be given a house and lot provided that he is poor? Now, how do you understand that? For you to own, for you to own a house, you should be poor. So, rich people are not included, correct? So, here, from a very broad term, every people, because of the word provided, it now limits the scope. That's the purpose of a proviso. So here, notice the highlighted phrases. We said that provisos are there to limit the application of statute, correct? But why is it, in this case, we also said it may enlarge? Are there discrepancies? I humbly submit there is none. Again, what is the purpose of statutory construction? It is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. In our discussion in Chapter 1, we also said that statutory construction is not an exact science. So even if there is a proviso, if the court thinks that it will defeat the intent of the legislature, it will not follow the purpose of a proviso. So, question, is it required to use provided, as we mentioned earlier, to call it a proviso? No. A proviso in a statute can exist even if it does not begin with the usual introductory word proviso. Provided. So, sometimes a proviso may be stated in a manner, for example, upon the condition that, or let's say, but it shall be necessary that. So, will that no longer be called proviso? Of course, no. It will still be called proviso, even if it does not begin with the word provided. Ordinary words understood in ordinary sense. Technical words in technical sense. As a general rule, words of a statute must be taken in their natural, plain, and ordinary signification. Strict grammatical usage will not control over general and popular usage. However, words may have a different meaning when it is used in a specific context of a special subject. Obviously, the studies of law is sui generis, di ba? Yan nga ang palaging sinasabi nila. The subject itself, statutory construction, for example. What do we mean by construction? Are we going to construct a building in this subject? Of course not. Construction was taken from the root word construe. So that's how a word can change its meaning when it is used in law. For example, domicile, domicile and residence. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, correct? But in law, there is a big difference between the two. Another example, the word action. In ordinary sense, we mean physical act, but in law, it is an ordinary civil action. In other words, it is a suit. In construing a word or expression in the statute susceptible of two or more meanings, the court will adopt that interpretation most in accord with the manifest purpose of the statute as gathered from the context. Again, the purpose of statutory construction, I cannot emphasize this more, is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. Where a particular word is obscure or of doubtful meaning, taken by itself, its obscurity or doubt may be removed by reference to associated words. In the absence of any qualification or intention to the contrary, the technical, not general or ordinary meaning of a word used in a statute should be adopted in the construction of the statute. In determining the meaning of a word used in a statute, the court may consider all known definitions of such word, including the dictionary definitions. However, resorting to dictionary definition is not necessary where the legislative intent can be readily gathered from a reading of the statute. Remember the case of Molina versus Rafferty, the one that we discussed in chapter 1. In that case, the court therein looked into the definition of the word agriculture. What did the court do? They resorted to the ordinary meaning which is found in the dictionary. I hope you watched our discussion in chapter 1. So let's have an illustrative case. In this case, the law in question was the anti-graft law. Okay? Under section 13 of the said law, when a public officer is acquitted, take note of the term acquitted, he shall be entitled to reinstatement and to his salaries and benefits which he failed to receive during suspension. A case for violation of anti-graft law against X was dismissed. Take note, the word used the term acquitted. However, the case against X was dismissed. Okay? So the issue is whether or not Section 13 will apply to X. The Supreme Court said no. The word acquitted has a legal meaning, which is finding of not guilty based on the merit. It does not include a dismissal of the case because dismissal does not amount to acquittal, except when the dismissal comes after the prosecution has presented all its evidence and is based on insufficiency of such evidence. So here, we can see that the court did not consider the common definition of dismissal. Kasi 'di ba, when we hear people normally, they mean dismissal of a case as acquittal. But in this case, sabi ng Supreme Court, teka muna, acquittal is different. When we say acquittal, it means the case was tried on merits. When we say dismissal, it is more on procedural grounds. Generic words and progressive construction. A word of generic, I'm sorry, a word of general signification employed in a statute should be construed in the absence of legislative intent to the contrary to comprehend not only peculiar conditions obtaining at the time of its enactment, but those that may normally arise after its approval as well. Progressive interpretation extends by construction the application of a statute to all subjects or conditions within the general purpose or scope that come into existence subsequent to its passage and thus keeps legislation from becoming ephemeral and transitory. So let's have an illustrative case for this principle. Here the facts are the following. The collector of customs prevented the entry of shipment of fresh apples imported by the private respondent without corresponding central bank release certificate. In this case kasi, the law in question was the Tariff and Customs Code of the Philippines. If you read section 102 of that law, it actually lists the prohibited importations into the Philippines. Now, in the list, fresh apples is not included. Okay? So the question, are apples prohibited? The Supreme Court said yes. It must be remembered that the revised administrative code is a general legislation. As such, it must have been intended to meet not only the peculiar conditions obtaining at the time of its enactment, but also designed to comprehend those that may normally arise after its approval. Take note, the revised administrative code is now the Tariff and Customs Code. So meaning, kasama daw ang mga apple. You know, the enumeration under this section was put there to safeguard national security, maintain public order, or protect public health. So according to the Supreme Court, the term merchandise of prohibited exportation used in the statute is broad enough to cover not only those already declared prohibited at the time of its adoption, but also goods, commodities, or articles that may be the subject of activities undertaken in violation of subsequent laws. So let's go to punctuation marks. Punctuation marks are actually important more than you think when you read a law. Say, for example, when you read your CODAL, you can better understand them when you know the purpose of the punctuation marks as used therein. However, in several cases decided by the Supreme Court, punctuation marks are actually weak indication of legislative intent. Why? Because punctuation marks are not part of a statute, nor are they part of the English language. However, take note, this principle is only as good as when there is no ambiguity. Okay? If there is, then punctuation marks may be resorted to in construing a law. If the court thinks that they can better give justice to the legislative intent, then it should consider the punctuation marks. The courts will not hesitate to change the punctuation when necessary to give the statute effect and intended by the legislature, disregarding the superfluous or incorrect punctuation marks and inserting others where necessary. Let's have an illustrative case. Here, the law in question is Section 694 of the Revised Administrative Code. What does the law say? Removal or suspension. If the charge against such subordinate or employee involves dishonesty, oppression, or grave misconduct or neglect in the performance of duty. In other words, an officer may be removed under Section 694 of the Revised Administrative Code. If you notice, I put emphasis on commas after the words dishonesty and oppression. In this case kasi, The question hinges on whether or not the words dishonesty and oppression are qualified with the phrase in the performance of duty. If you notice, only grave misconduct or neglect has no comma, correct? So, what did the Supreme Court say? Only the phrase grave misconduct or neglect is qualified by the words in the performance of duty. Because again, like I said, was there a comma after the word dishonesty? Yes. Was there a comma after the word oppression? Yes. But was there a comma after the phrase grave misconduct or neglect? None. Meaning it should be read continuously with the phrase in the performance of duty. So it can be summarized as follows. If dishonesty, it is not required to be committed in the performance of a duty. If oppression, it is not required to be in the performance of a duty. But if it is grave misconduct or neglect, then it is required to be committed in the performance of a duty. Why? Because there was no comma after the phrase grave misconduct or neglect. I hope it makes sense now. Actually, in my view, this is the most important topic in this chapter. So I hope you will bear with me. So, use of specific words. When we say and, it is conjunctive, meaning it is conjunction, joinder, or union. When we say or, it is disjunctive, meaning it signifies a disassociation and independence of one thing from other things enumerated. The use of the word and does not necessarily signify a conjunctive relationship if such interpretation will be contrary to the clear legislative intent. So we must, again, always go back to the purpose of statutory construction. In the case of Caltex versus Palomar, it was therein hinted by the Supreme Court that even if it is an art or process and not an exact science, it has a primary objective, that is to ascertain and give effect to the intent of the legislature. So even if we have in our mind what is and what is or, if such plain usage will run counter to the legislative intent, then it must not be followed. So let's have an illustrative case. So in this case, the law in question was Section 5 of PD 49. Under Section 5, copyright shall consist in the exclusive right to print, reprint, publish, copy, distribute, multiply, sell, and make photographs, photo engravings, and pictorial illustrations of the works. So the issue was whether or not a person can be held liable for copyright infringement if they are engaged in the selling and distribution of unauthorized Microsoft computer programs without evidence that the same person is also the person who printed or copied the products for sale in his store. So the Supreme Court said, yes. While it is true that under the rules on syntax, the conjunctive word and denotes a joinder or union of words or phrases or clause, and it is different from the disjunctive word or that signals disassociation or independence, noteworthy to emphasize that a rule on statutory construction dictates that law should be construed in a manner that avoids absurdity or unreasonableness. So, as earlier mentioned, we must always go back to the primary purpose of statutory construction. Many Supreme Court cases already dictates that the tools of construction must not be followed if it leads to absurdity and unreasonableness. The conjunctive and should not be taken in its ordinary acceptance but should be construed like the disjunctive or if the literal interpretation of the law would prevent or obscure the legislative intent. Because it is not just a power, but it is also a duty. It is the duty of the courts to construe statutes. In so doing, they are duty bound also, okay, to avoid such unacceptable and deplorable results. So, another illustrative case. Here, the law in question was Republic Act 7742. What happened in this case is that the Board of Trustees of HDMF modified the rules and regulations that implemented Republic Act 7742. Okay, so under the modified rule, for a company to be entitled to a waiver or suspension of fund coverage, it must have a plan providing for both provident or retirement and housing benefits. So according to the petitioner, that is actually wrong. The modified rules was contravening Republic Act 7742. In their argument, they said that Section 19 of RA 7742 should be construed as either, okay, either own provident or employee housing plans. So we can see here there is already a clash, okay, between the two interpretations. But what was the statement of the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court said RMBSA is correct. The Supreme Court said that the amended the amendments to the rules and regulations implementing RA 7742 are null and void. Why? Because it actually modified the provisions of Republic Act 7742. We know for a fact that in implementing rules and regulations to be effective, it is required that the regulation be germane to the objects and purpose of the law, and not in contradiction to, but in conformity with the standards prescribed by the law. So here, it is actually contradictory to Republic Act 7742. Therefore, the Supreme Court said it is null and void. So what are the important points that we need to remember in this case? When the law uses phrase and slash or, this effectively means and or, meaning either both items in the enumeration or either one in the enumeration can be present to satisfy the condition. When the law uses the word and slash or, unless the law gives executive agency the choice to use and or in its implementing rules and regulations, the agency must also use and slash or in implementing rules and regulations to be consistent with the law. Again, do not forget that the IRR cannot violate the law that it seeks to implement. So, statutes may be classified as either mandatory or discretionary or directory. Okay? The classification is important in resolving the question of what effect should be given to the mandate of a statute. So when we say shall, it means mandatory. It contains words of commands or of prohibition. When we say may, it is discretionary. It is permissive or discretionary in nature and merely outlines the act to be done. Here, you have the choice to act according to the dictates of your own judgment and conscience. So let's have an illustrative case. So in this case, the law in question was Section 23 of PD 1592. It says there, upon receipt of the order of the court setting the time for the initial hearing, the Commissioner of Land Registration shall cause notice of initial hearing to be published once in the Official Gazette and once in a newspaper of general circulation in the Philippines. Take note of the highlighted phrases. The notice in this case was published in the Official Gazette but not in a newspaper newspaper of general circulation. For the private respondent, this is a mere procedural defect, and that the publication in the official gazette is sufficient to confer the court with jurisdiction to commence the registration proceedings. Is the private respondent correct? So we'll find out. So according to the Supreme Court, this answer is impelled by the demands of statutory construction and the due process rationale behind publication requirement. The said word denotes an imperative and thus indicates the mandatory character of a statute. Because what was used in the law was shall, okay? Meaning it should be mandatory. So publication should be one in the official gazette and one in the newspaper of general circulation. It is not allowed to choose between the two because the law did not use the term may. Again, it used shall. So if we are to if we are not to comply strictly with the publication requirement, the persons who may be interested or whose rights may be adversely affected would be barred from contesting an application which they had no knowledge of. So that's why publication is imperative. So, question: can shall be expressed in similar terms? Supreme Court said yes. In the case of Ledesma versus CA, the court clarified that in the conduct of barangay conciliation pursuant to PD 1508, which states that all proceedings provided for herein, the parties must appear in person without the assistance of counsel or representative. Here, even if the law did not actually use the word shall, but it used must, then the effect is the same. It is still considered mandatory. So, another illustrative case. So, we already discussed shall. Now, let's discuss may. Okay? Here, the law in question was Article 11 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. Here, you can see it states may be removed. Okay? May be removed. Take note of the highlighted phrase. One of the issues in this case is whether or not the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over an action for quo warranto against justice of the Supreme Court, okay, despite the fact that the latter is an impeachable officer. I hope you read the full text of this case because this is very instructive, okay? So the Supreme Court said impeachment is not, okay, impeachment is not an exclusive remedy to remove an invalidly appointed or invalidly elected impeachable government official. The language of Article 11, Section 2 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution does not foreclose a quo warranto proceeding against an impeachable officer, since the phrase used in the said provision is that the officers enumerated therein may be removed from office on impeachment. This denotes discretion and not mandatory. In quo warranto, you are basically challenging an individual's right and authority over the position he or she holds. But it does not necessarily follow that it can no longer be used just because an official is an impeachable officer. Take note, the Constitution did not use the word shall, it used the word may. Okay? May be removed from office on impeachment. So it is discretionary. Question: how should we determine whether the use of may in a statute is mandatory or discretionary? It should be determined in each case from the apparent intention of the statute as gathered from the context, as well as the language of the particular provision. The test is whether, taken as a whole and viewed in the light of the surrounding circumstances, it can be said that a purpose existed on the part of the legislator to enact a law mandatory in character. Another question. Since it is the permissive in form of a statute provision conclusive, in the case of Linares versus Valdivia, the Supreme Court held that even though Section 450 of the Code of Civil Procedure states that property may be attached on execution in like manner as upon writs of attachment, it should still be regarded as mandatory, considering that there are no other methods of effective levy under the rules and considering also that powers under which a person may be divested of property be strictly construed. So here, even if the language uses may, it is still regarded as mandatory. The use of the word including followed by an enumeration generally denotes that the enumeration is not exclusive. The word include means to take part in or compromise as a part of a whole. The use of the word involving signifies the possibility of inclusion of other matters not included in the enumeration. Okay, for example, concerning, having to do with, or affecting, entailing, requiring, implying, or necessitating, including, containing, or compromising. In other words, putting including or involving in a statute means such as but not limited to, okay? Because it is not exclusive. If you encounter them, okay, if you encounter including and involving a statute, the enumeration there should not be deemed as exclusive. Now, how do you know whether a thing is covered therein? Kasi sabi natin hindi exclusive eh. You can determine whether it is included therein by determining whether it is within the intent of the legislature. So let's have an illustrative case. So here, you can see the highlighted word. It used the term including. Okay, the law in question here was LLDA resolution number 41. Now, in this case, petitioner was engaged in the fabrication of sterling silver jewelry. He claimed exemption from the requirement of securing LLDA clearance on the ground that it was engaged in cottage industry. So, is the petitioner correct? The Supreme Court said the word include means to take in or compromise as a part of a whole. The principle of expressio unius es exclusio alterius does not apply where other circumstances indicate that the enumeration was not intended to be exclusive or where the enumeration is by way of example only. Said, said legal maxim should be applied only as a means of discovering legislative intent which is not otherwise manifest. Therefore, the Court of Appeals in this case was wrong. Okay? The Court of Appeals was wrong in ruling that only the three activities enumerated in Section 2 of the LLDA are exempted. Because if you will see the LLDA, it used the word including. Okay? So the enumeration therein is not exclusive. So another, oh, the same case. So question, was the petitioner covered by the exemption provided for cottage industries on the ground that the petitioner's business exceeded the threshold on maximum capital of cottage industries? The Supreme Court said no. It is important to note that the court held in this case that the principle of expressio unius as exclusio alterius is inapplicable when the enumeration is by way of example only. So it was by way of example only. Okay? Or when the enumeration is prefaced with the words including or involving. So like we said earlier, when we encounter these words, when we encounter these terms in a statute, it is not to be understood as exclusive because it is tantamount to saying such as but not limited to. So, affirmative and prohibitory words. Negative words and phrases are to be regarded as mandatory, while those in the affirmative are merely directory. To better understand this, let's have an illustrative case. So in this case, the petitioner was convicted for violation of BP 22 or the bouncing checks law on the basis of stipulation of facts entered into between the prosecution and the defense during the pre-trial conference. So it appears that the stipulation was not signed by the petitioner nor by his counsel. However, petitioner waived his right to present evidence and, in lieu thereof, submitted a memorandum confirming the stipulation of facts. So what was stated under the rules? Okay, after we read the facts, now let's go to what the law says. Under Section 4 of Rule 188, no agreement or admission made or entered during the pretrial conference shall, okay, take note, shall be used in evidence against the accused unless reduced to writing and, take note, signed by him and his counsel. I hope you take note of the highlighted phrases. In this case, what do you think is Section 4, Rule 188, 118? Is it negative or affirmative? What do you think? Obviously, it is negative. Why? Because at the beginning of Section 4, Rule 188, it says no agreement or admission. So it is actually prohibiting. So it is negative. What did we say about negative words? It is mandatory. So here, notice also that the rules uses the word shall. Okay? I highlighted that word. On top of that, it says reduced to writing and signed by him and his counsel. Did the petitioner comply with this requirement? Remember, the stipulation was not signed by the petitioner nor by his counsel. So, the Supreme Court ruled by its very language, the rule is mandatory. Under the rule of statutory construction, negative words and phrases are to be regarded as mandatory, while those in the affirmative are merely directory. That's what we said earlier. So it is mandatory. In this single paragraph, you will remember that negative words are deemed mandatory. Second, okay, according to the Supreme Court, the use of the term shall further emphasizes its mandatory character and means that it is imperative, operating to impose a duty which may be enforced. So it should be deemed mandatory. Okay? Lastly, when there is doubt, penal laws are construed liberally in favor of the accused and strictly against the government. We discussed this in the previous chapter. So, exceptions. When the statute itself enumerates the exceptions to the application of the general rule, the exceptions are strictly but reasonably construed. So, why do you think we have this principle that it should be strictly construed? Because, in the first place, why would the lawmakers add an exception to the statute if they are not intended to be mandatory? Also, notice the qualifier reasonably. Because, like we said in the previous chapter, the courts should avoid construing a law if it leads to absurdity and unreasonableness. Second, the courts cannot add to the exceptions by implication. So generally, if a law wants to put an exception, it should expressly put it. In other words, where a general rule is established by a statute with exceptions, the court will not curtail the general rule nor add to the exceptions by mere implication. Third, an expressed exception excludes all others, although it is always proper in determining the applicability of the rule to inquire whether, in a particular case, it accords with reason and justice. Again, the court should avoid absurdity and unreasonableness. That's why You can read in the slide, it accords with reason and justice. Because if it leads to absurdity or unreasonableness, then the courts should avoid it. So, periods. Under Article 13 of the new Civil Code, when the laws speak of years, months, days, or nights, it shall be understood that years are of 365 days each, months of 30 days of 24 hours, and nights from sunset to sunrise. If months are designated by their name, they shall be computed by the number of days which they respectively have. In computing a period, the first day shall be excluded and the last day included. So let's have some examples. When we say 10 months, that's 300 days. Because again, when we speak of months, it shall be 30 days. So if 30 days times 10, that's 300. So 300 days. 1 year, 365 days. That's very self-explanatory. March, 31 days. Now, compare this with the first one. Di ba sabi natin when the law speaks of months, it shall be 30 days. Bakit dito 31 days? Because we did not speak of month, okay? We used the term or we used the name of the month itself, which is March. Again, go back to what I said in the preceding slide. When the month is designated by its name, it shall be computed by the number of days which it has. So kapag pangalan mismo ng buwan ang inilagay ng batas, titingnan mo kung ilang araw sa buwan na iyon. So, 1 week, 7 successive days. Perhaps you cannot really appreciate this now, but remember, the rules on statutory construction can apply to contracts. So, for instance, the contract of loan says that the debtor shall pay within 2 months, or let's say sometimes the contract will designate its name. Let's say March, let's say June. In those cases, you will know how to use the rules on statutory construction in order to resolve the ambiguities. A provision of a statute that applies to persons or things in plural form may also be applied to the same person or thing in singular form. A word in singular form should also be generally construed as covering its enlarged and plural sense. So if you see persons or things in a statute stated in its plural form, that doesn't mean that it should only apply to plural persons or things. It can also apply to singular person or thing. To better understand, let's have an illustrative case. So, in this case, Article 996 of the New Civil Code, if a widow or widower and legitimate children or descendants are left, the surviving spouse has in the succession the same share as that of each children. Okay? Whether or not the word children in Article 996 of the New Civil Code includes singular word child. What did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court noted that it is a principle of construction that the words in plural include singular, and hence Article 996 could also be read and applied in the manner as when the widow or widower and a legitimate child are left. So, again, it doesn't mean that the language of the law is plural, it can only apply to plural. It can also apply to singular thing or person. So let's go to another topic, association and relationship of words, phrases, and provisions. First, we have nocitur associis. When a word or phrase is ambiguous or open to various meanings, its true meaning may be made clear or specific by considering the company in which it is found or with which it is associated. When two words are grouped together and ordinarily have a similar meaning but are not equally comprehensive, the general word will be limited and qualified by special word. Words should be construed consistently, not contradictorily, unless contradictions are clearly unavoidable. Sa madaling sabi, when, for example, there is an enumeration of words or things in a law, okay? Now, one word from the enumeration is ambiguous. So that word is ambiguous in itself. How should the courts resolve the ambiguity? By reference to the other words or things from the enumeration. Why? Because it is understood that they are associated with each other, that the legislature has not put therein an unrelated words or things. I hope I am making sense. For us to better understand, let's have an illustrative case. So, in this case, the ombudsman ordered, okay, take note, ordered the preventive suspension of the petitioners pending the investigation of administrative complaints filed against said officers and employees. So here, there were administrative complaints against the petitioners. Okay. Now, the ombudsman decided that they be placed under preventive suspension. Take note, ha, the ombudsman ordered the preventive suspension. Now, the Solicitor General argued that the Ombudsman can only recommend. It does not have the power to order the preventive suspension. So, what is the law in question here? It was Article 11 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. Under that provision, it gives the office of the Ombudsman the power to take appropriate action direct the officer concerned to take appropriate action against a public official or employee at fault and recommend, take note, recommend his removal, suspension, demotion, etc. So, can the ombudsman order, okay, take note of the facts, order the preventive suspension? So, the Supreme Court said, when the Constitution vested on Ombudsman the power to recommend the suspension of public office official or employees, it referred to suspension as punitive measure. Okay. All the words associated with the word suspension in said provision referred to penalties in administrative cases. Okay. Example, removal, demotion, fines, censure. Under the rule of nocitur associis, the word suspension should be given the same sense as the other words with which it is associated. So here we can see that in resolving the question of whether or not the ombudsman can order the preventive suspension, the court used nocitur associis. How? The court conceded actually that under the Constitution, the ombudsman is expressly authorized to recommend, okay, recommend only. The ombudsman, okay, the ombudsman can recommend the suspension. But if you will read the constitutional provision kasi, ano ba ang mga kasama ng word na suspension? 'Di ba removal, demotion, fine, censure? In other words, the Constitution pertains to suspension as a punitive measure. Insofar as suspension as a punitive measure is concerned, meaning punishment, the ombudsman can only recommend. However, insofar as preventive suspension is concerned, which is not punitive, the ombudsman can have the power to order the suspension. I hope that's clear. Okay? So, we have ejusdem generis. We actually discussed ejusdem generis in chapter 1. We said that when there is a general word or phrase in a statute, its meaning should be restricted only to those named in the preceding words. So we mentioned that this doctrine was not followed in the case of Philippine American Drug Co. versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue. when the Supreme Court interpreted Section 183B of the tax code. Because according to the Supreme Court, it will defeat the purpose of the law, that is, to include all charges or items of expense in determining the advance sales tax. So, another principle, express mention and implied exclusion. The expression of one thing in law as a general rule means the exclusion of others not expressly mentioned. What is expressed puts an end to what is implied. What is the purpose? It is to limit the coverage of a legal provision to those expressly mentioned therein. So ito, sobrang dali lang naman. This principle is actually based on the rules of logic and the natural workings of human mind. Kung anong hindi kasali, edi hindi siya kasali. Simple lang naman ang principle na ito. So when it is not applicable, okay? Why do we have this? Because statutory construction is not an exact science. So when does this principle not apply? It cannot be invoked where no reason exists as to why other things not enumerated should be excluded. Circumstances indicate that enumeration is not intended to be exclusive or where the enumeration is by way of example only, such as including, not limited, because again, the legislative intent is always controlling. So it is always important that we go back to the purpose of statutory construction. So let's have this doctrine of necessary implication. It seeks to expand the coverage or scope of the statute beyond what is expressly stated for the purpose of making it effective. Statutes cannot be expected to cover each and every scenario that the law seeks to regulate. Thus, it becomes necessary for the court to fill the gaps by understanding statutes as by implication containing all such provisions as may be necessary to effectuate its object and purpose, or to make effective rights, powers, privileges, or jurisdiction which it grants, including all such collateral and subsidiary consequences as may be fairly and logically inferred from its terms. Actually, the doctrine of necessary implication is somewhat similar to progressive construction. Okay? Why? Because the wisdom of this doctrine is that what is thought at the time of its enactment to be an all-embracing legislation may be inadequate to provide the unfolding events of the future, similar to the doctrine of progressive construction. It is one which, under the circumstances, is compelled by a reasonable view of the statute, and the contrary of which would be improbable and absurd. We mentioned in Chapter 1 that the courts should avoid a construction that leads to absurdity and unreasonableness. So, in other words, when courts employ the doctrine of necessary implication, if they think employing such doctrine results to absurdity or unreasonableness, then they will not apply it. The doctrine of necessary implication applies only when it is compelled by a reasonable view of the statute. So let's have an illustrative case. Here, the law in question was Section 2 of RA 6683. Okay? It states that the benefits under this act shall apply to all regular, temporary, casual, and emergency employees regardless of age who have rendered at least a total of 2 consecutive years of government service as of the date of separation. If we read the law, there is no mention of coterminous employee, correct? So the question is a coterminous employee necessarily implied from this provision? Okay, that's the issue. The Supreme Court said coterminous employee is no different from casual or temporary employee, and that by necessary implication, the inclusion of the latter, which is the casual or temporary employee, in the class of government employees entitled to the benefits of the law, necessarily implies that the former coterminous employee should be entitled to such benefit. So you will notice here that the doctrine we earlier discussed, the expressio unius est exclusio alterius, was rejected by the Supreme Court. Sabi ng Supreme Court, such doctrine does not apply here. What applies here is the doctrine of necessary implication. In other words, coterminous employees, even if they are not expressly mentioned in the law, since they are no different, okay, take note, they are no different from a casual or temporary employee, kasi ganun ang nature nila eh. Pareho sila. So, since pareho sila, they are necessarily implied. That's according to the Supreme Court. So, another principle, casus omissus. A person, object, or thing omitted from an enumeration must be held to have been intentionally omitted. Can operate and apply only if when the omission has been clearly established. Such rule, being restrictive in nature, has more particular application to statutes that should be strictly construed. The court cannot, under its power of interpretation, supply the omission even though the omission may have resulted from inadvertence or because the case in question was not foreseen or contemplated. So actually the rules of casus omissus does not apply, okay, where it is shown that the legislature did not intend to exclude the person, thing, or object from the enumeration. So, if the legislative intent is clearly apparent, the court may supply the omission in order to carry the intent of the legislature. So, let's go to this topic. Each to each. Words in different parts of a statute must be referred to in their appropriate connection, giving to each in its place its proper force and effect, and if possible, rendering none of them useless or superfluous, even if strict grammatical construction demands otherwise. The antecedents and consequences should be read distributively to the effect that each word is to be applied to to the subject to which it appears by context most appropriately related and to which is the most applicable. So to better understand, let's have an illustrative case. So here, the question actually hinges on when to count the 15-day period within which to appeal within which to appeal a judgment of conviction in a criminal action. Will it be counted from the date of promulgation of judgment or from the date of receipt of the notice of judgment? If you read the rules, notice the highlighted phrases. You will notice that the word promulgation was first mentioned before the word notice. Okay? You will also notice that the word judgment was first mentioned before the word order. Correct. Meaning, they are each to each. So, promulgation pertains to the judgment while notice pertains to the order. That's why I changed the color, yellow to yellow, green to green. That's how each case, that's how each, each to each applies. Okay? So, when to count the 15-day period within which to appeal a judgment of conviction in a criminal action? That's the issue. According to the Supreme Court, the word promulgation in Section 5 should be construed as referring to judgment, while the word notice should be construed as referring to order. Okay? So, going back to the issue, if it concerns judgment, the 15 days should be counted from the promulgation of judgment. On the other hand, if it concerns an order, the 15 days should be counted from the notice of the order. So that's how you appreciate this case. So let's go to the topic of the doctrine of last antecedent. Relative words refer to the nearest antecedent unless it is prevented by the context. This means that relative words refer to the nearest antecedent unless the context clearly prevents this interpretation. So, in other words, when we encounter qualifying terms in a law, we should generally relate them to the word, phrase, or provision immediately before them, rather than to something further back or distantly located in the sentence or section. Qualifying words restrict or modify only the words or phrases to which they are immediately associated and not those distantly or remotely located. To make it simple, okay, qualifying words only restrict or modify the words or phrases which they are immediately connected. They do not affect those that are far away or remotely mentioned. But then again, we discussed this in chapter 1. I mentioned the case of Tanyada versus Tuvera. So I hope you watched that video. So let's go to context and related clauses. The context of a provision, in light of the clauses in the same statute that is related to it, could shed light in statutory interpretation. Every part of a statute must be interpreted with reference to the context, that is, every part of the statute must be considered together with the other parts and kept subservient to the general intent of the whole enactment. In other words, every part of a statute is not isolated. Okay? Each provision must be interpreted with reference to the statute as a whole. We must consider all parts together, okay? Recognizing their interrelationship and ensure that the interpretation aligns with the general purpose and intent of the entire enactment. So we also discussed this in the previous chapter that laws should be construed as a whole. So thank you for listening. I hope this helps. May your love for the law remain strong as always. Maraming salamat